Good evening. A working meeting of the Board of Trustees of Socorro Independent District will be held today, Monday, May 1st, 2023, and the time is 5:30. If you will please join me with the Pledge of Allegiance, and we have established a quorum. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, we will proceed to public comment. Mr. Tommy Hill, you're up. Excuse me, Tommy. Let me do. Thank you. Let me read the. Once you're up there, let me read the. I'm sorry, I've been on the sun all day. The board encourages comment for the members of the public. However, the primary purpose of this meeting is to conduct district business. Therefore, to ensure the efficient conduct of this meeting, all speakers must comply with the following rules. Address the board at all times. Only persons who have timely signed up to speak will be called to speak. Comments should be pertain to district issues or business in accordance with board policy. Respect the rights of others, display civility and decorum, and refrain from using harmful and offensive content such as defamation, obscene or fighting words or gestures. Complaints will be referred to a grievance policy. Do not engage with conduct or that disrupts or delays this meeting. Each speaker is legally responsible for the content and consequences of his or her own statements. In order to have enough time to complete all items on this agenda, each speaker will be given, since there's only 2 speakers, 5 minutes. If a person speaks in multiple agenda items, not more than a total of 5 minutes. All speakers, including those who signed up to speak on the agenda items, will be called to speak during open forum. The presiding officer will take all necessary measures to ensure that order and decorum is preserved during the meeting. We expect all persons to comply with the presiding officer's directives. By law, the board cannot discuss or act on any item which is not posted on the agenda. Thank you for your cooperation. Let's proceed to open forum. Tommy, go ahead.
Okay, sir. Okay, first of all, I'm gonna start here with the sped clerks. When we passed the 304 to 305, that was 72 cents. 72 cents was $28,000. From 305 to 306, it's right there on the salary scale, but you guys made them wait. That's $1.22. Basic math is 1.57. I mean, 1 and 5/7. So that'd be times 28,000 times 1.71 if you do the fraction. So that equals up to a little bit about 48,000, but most of the numbers that HR gives are bloated, so give it 50,000. It's nice round numbers, but everybody up here, well, not everybody, act like that was too much. It wasn't too much. But we could have already had that done, moved on. But we didn't. Okay. Now let's go on to this. We didn't even get this far because nobody wanted to talk about it. Let's just put it on agenda. What I've been talking about for 6 months now, since the beginning of the year, we stopped and we didn't pay anybody over 15 years. Now, on that, nobody knew that there's 3 options unless they went and got the board book. You guys know, but let's just put it away. So, option 1 was everything that I was talking about, just option 1. And then I hear that this was going to cost $2 million. No, that was incorrect. The reason why it was going to cost $2 million is because option 2 and option 3, those were added on. Nobody explained those. We could have had those in a committee meeting. Why didn't we do that? Why? I don't know. Maybe we talked to HR. No committee meeting. That's why we're here today. We get this information. They come unprepared. They don't give you the answer. You guys come back and you say, we don't understand. So who loses? The employee loses. Do we think that's right? No, that is not right. Everybody plays their game and the employee loses every time. Sorry. So we need more discussion on what option 2 and option 3 is. Option 1 costs the district about $1,800 per person on option 1. Option 2 costs the district about $4,800, round numbers. 3 people, $14,000, somewhere around there. Option 3, this is where all the money is. This was $1 million for less people, cost the district $4,800 per each person. Now, but then we got to hear, oh, well, I'm making a $2 million discussion. That nobody explained to anybody. Why didn't we have it on a supplemental meeting? Why? Can anybody answer that? No, we just didn't. So that gives the board up here to come here and say they just don't understand. Now, who loses out? Tell the public who loses out. The employee loses out. That's not right. So, you guys need to explain to us what option 2 and option 3 are. Because those are the ones that are raising the bar up with less people. I'm not saying that's not good, but nobody explained it. But they did explain option 1. Why did we have to table it? That's not right. Now, TASB only went to 15 years. TASB is just a suggestion. You guys are the boss. The board is the boss. TASB's not the boss. You guys make the decision up here. TASB doesn't. It's just a suggestion. We need to do the right thing. We need to at least pass option 1. I'm all for helping out the employees, but I don't know what option 3 is. I get that part. But why table everything? Why make them work? Why take a chance on them having to wait until next year? That's not right. But that's what we did. And we need to fix it. Now, who knows who gets to vote on this now? We don't know. It changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Our next speaker is Ms. Rosie Bettis.
Good evening, President Mena, Superintendent Dr. Carmen, and Board of Trustees. My name is Rosie Perez, and I proudly represent the members of West Texas Alliance. And I thank you for allowing us to speak tonight. And I know that Tommy is very passionate about what he comes up here to speak about, and it's because he cares about the employees and the members that he serves. So I'm up here today because I saw what was on the agenda, and I became very familiar and knowledgeable with TASB and the salary studies that they conduct on behalf of school districts throughout the state. I became knowledgeable about this 7 years ago when I successfully collaborated with special education department directors and district administration to reclassify the educational diagnosticians and the speech language pathologist. Included in that request was the position of special education clerks. 3 requests on their behalf have been submitted, and 3 times they have been denied. When I have requested and received information about the study, a 1-sentence response from TASB has been provided stating that there is no reason to reclassify this position. There is no other information or supporting documentation provided. This is a specialized position that if you ask others, other districts in this region alone, nobody has a special education clerk, right? And so I know that they're supposed to do comparisons of these types of positions with other positions in the region and in the state. In the years since I have been advocating for this group, I have done my comparisons. I have met with these employees, and I have firsthand knowledge. I have seen the responsibilities and accountabilities of this position, and it has greatly evolved, and the numbers of students needing special education services has grown exponentially. When I compare this position to other positions in their same pay grade, they have a higher level, they have more responsibilities, a higher level of state and federal accountability measures tied to their position, and the work that they do affects the students directly and the services that they need. So, because of a few school board members that have listened to the information that we have provided, we have successfully, they were successfully given a pay grade promotion at the last official school board meeting. On the TASB webpage today, it stated that the state of Texas is lagging in teacher compensation and has not kept up with inflation and is probably closer to what it was 10 years ago. This also affects our support personnel, not just our teachers. And that's why we are up here advocating today is for our support personnel, because they are an extension of the services that our teachers provide on a daily basis to our students. And with that being said, TASB states that they remain dedicated to the preservation of local control of public education. So technically, then it's up to you all. You are the local controlling board of compensation of whatever happens in our district. So we're asking you to do the right thing and pay the employees the compensation that they deserve, because we need to realize their worth to this district and we need to compensate them accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bettis. At this time, we will proceed to the board workshop. Item A, understanding compensation in school. Presenter, Ms. Luz Cadena.
I'm going to introduce her.
Okay, go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Mena, Board President, Board of Trustees, Superintendent Dr. Carmen. I'd like to introduce our TASB Senior Compensation Consultant, Luz Cadena. She will be conducting the board workshop, Understanding Compensation in Schools and related items as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and good evening, Board President, board members, and Dr. Carmen. I am glad to be back. It's always a pleasure to be able to visit. I am originally from New Mexico, and I have family in Las Cruces and in El Paso, so I kind of call it home. So we're going to go ahead and get started. There's a lot of information that we're going to go through. And please feel free to let me know if you have a question, and I will assist you. So I'm going to start with basically the title of this presentation, right? Because compensation, while compensation is in every employment organization, you know, where they have to pay, it's very it's a little bit different in public school districts, and that's because we're dealing with limited financial resources. Okay, so just kind of to get that going. All right, so why does it matter? Why is it important that we understand compensation? Again, with that, it's because the salaries and benefits constitute 85% of most districts' budgets. It is the biggest expenditure component of district funds. So application of best practices helps ensure that those limited funds that you have are utilized in the most effective manner, and that they provide the best compensation that you can provide to your employees within those resources. We would all like to pay more, we just can't. So I'm going to talk about fundamental concepts here. And really pretty much beginning with an effective pay system is going to provide the district the direction of meeting those strategic goals, which are to recruit quality candidates by ensuring that you have some competitive starting rates of pay. it also provides for the retention of your employees by ensuring that when jobs are placed into the system, that they're placed in those pay grades based on the job value and the market price. It's not the incumbent. We look at what is the job, what are the job responsibilities, and what is that market price. Not every job is going to have a market price, and we're going to talk about that. We also want to make sure that you're able to reward your employees for continued service by providing pay increases that mirror what your peers are providing so that you remain competitive with your peers. And then lastly, controlling costs. As I've mentioned, we have limited funds available, and so you want to make sure that those funds are managed wisely. And you want to monitor the system regularly so that you don't end up overpaying or underpaying for jobs. Now, total rewards, I want to just briefly cover this, because when we talk about compensation, it's also talking about the total rewards. So compensation is base pay. And then there's other components that are associated with that for total rewards. And so the total rewards package not only includes the salary, but it's also going to have your benefits, the other incentives that you may pay, so any other tool that you, the organization, use to recruit, retain, and reward your employees. We talked about compensation. That's the cash that's provided to the employees. The benefits can be anything from providing, the medical health insurance, paid time off, even work culture. Okay, is part of this whole total rewards. Working conditions, organizational climate, as I mentioned, working conditions, personal relationships. Those are a totality of things that encompass total rewards and not just the base pay. Now I'm going to talk about pay strategy, and pay strategy is really how the district wants to pay relative to the market. What you have in place is a market-based pay system. It's a system where we look at the market rates of pay and we ensure that your structures are aligned to those market rates for the jobs within each pay grade, and we're going to talk a whole lot more about that. And so there are primarily 3 types of pay strategies that we have. And the first pay strategy is one that we refer to, and that's lagging the market. So primarily that means that your structure, your midpoints, how we set the midpoint and the range minimum and the range maximum may be set lower than what the market rates are for those groups of jobs, benchmarks that we use to build your structure. And most districts don't intentionally set a lag the market strategy, but when funds are tight or when they're changing systems for implementation purposes, they may have to go into a lag the market system strategy and then bring it up to a market match market structure. So that's the first one. The match the market, that's the most common pay structure. And when I say pay structure, those are your ranges. Those are your midpoints, okay? We connect your midpoints to market. And so a match the market pay strategy is when we look at the market, we build your structures, and we say we're going to set your midpoints at market or above market in anticipation of market movement, because the market moves all the time. It's going to move, and so even if we set you right at 100% of market, We know that the neighboring districts are going to give pay increases, and so the value of the market price for jobs is going to move. So we generally set it a little bit above the market. We still call it match because it's just above. But that provides you with very competitive ranges, yet they are affordable for the district, okay? And then last is the lead strategy. And in the lead strategy, basically pay, your structures are set much more competitive than what the market rates are. And where we see this type of strategy is going to be, let's say, for your bus drivers, where you're paying $20 an hour or $18 an hour because you can't find them, right? You've got to be competitive. You want to be able to lead the market so that you can recruit and you can retain. Most organizations cannot have a lead pay strategy for all pay groups. It's not sustainable. But they can have it for select jobs. Another group where they typically will have a lead strategy may be for teachers. They are the core of the education environment, that they are our core, our mission. And so districts want to make sure that teacher pay is competitive. And so those are kind of the examples of those pay strategies. And those are primarily the structure, okay? It's not necessarily individual pay. It's your pay ranges. And for the most part, the pay ranges that we have built for the district have been match the market, okay? I'm going to talk about pay equity, and pay equity is really the concept of fairness. How does an employee feel that pay is fair? There's 3 types of pay equity concepts that we have in compensation. And so the first one is the external. And that's really just a measure of how competitive your pay is relative to the other employers that you compete for talent, right? So your pay compared to, neighboring districts, maybe other employers that are non-education employers, because you want to make sure that you're competitive for other jobs that are not just in education. And this measure of equity relies on the use of salary survey data. It's the only way, it's the only approach that we can use as far as how competitive is your pay relative to what those that you compete with for talent are, for the jobs where we can get market. Not every job has a market price, but there are relationships in jobs. There are relationships of levels of skill, effort, and responsibility. They're similar, not the same, and that's how we place positions that don't have market data, okay? It is, we have valid data for jobs. We look at what is the similarity of other jobs where there's not market, and then we place. And sometimes these jobs may be more, they may have a higher level of skill set. So we place higher. If they're comparable, they're slotted in the same grade. All right, then there's the internal equity. The internal equity is that relationship internally, right? So the jobs, the incumbents within the organization, what are the responsibilities of those positions within your organization? What are those levels of skill, effort, and responsibility, those requirements within your organization? And we place them internally. We place them, we group them, similar, and I'll be repeating that, similar, not same, okay? So that's how we place them internally. The higher the level of skill, effort, and responsibility for jobs, and even working conditions, like those that may have working under hazardous conditions, right? More hazardous conditions than others. We refer to those that I just mentioned, level of skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions, as compensable factors. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those. TASB didn't make those up. Those are standard compensation factors that are utilized to determine the comparability of jobs based on those levels. Then there's the individual pay equity. And that's mostly defined by your value system. So those are many times driven by philosophy, right? So for example, job experience. Are you only going to credit job experience that's from school districts, other educational entities? Or are you going to credit experience outside when you can? Like for jobs, let's say it's a custodian. A custodian that comes from a hospital versus a custodian that's worked in a school district. Is that experience going to be comparable? Are you going to see it comparable? So those are those individual pay equity where we begin to value. What is the value system of the experience of individuals? The skill set. Are you going to value skill set? Let's say you've got a secretary that you're hiring and they're coming from a bank. Is that skill set, do you value that skill set the same as you would value the skill set in another school district? I would hope so, because it's a skill set. They have to be able to perform those duties, right? And in fact, many times, that skill set is probably more current sometimes, just because technology, advances very fast, and sometimes when we bring people from outside sectors, outside of educational sectors, skill sets tend to be a little bit more advanced. They're just more exposed at times. And then the other is performance, individual performance, right? We don't have performance pay system. It's very costly. Very, very few districts have a performance pay system, and those that have had it, it wasn't sustainable and they had to stop. So that's kind of the difference between these three types of pay equity that go into when we're talking about compensation. So just to summarize it, because it's a lot of information, external, that's between the employers, those that you compete with for your employees. Internal, that's between the jobs within your organization. And then individual, that's between employees. Okay, we're going to talk about pay systems because I think it's important to understand the pay system as a whole and the type of pay system that you have. There are these primary or basic components of a pay system, which entail the job family. That's basically the group of jobs that have work that is of the same nature, but different levels of skill and responsibility. So for example, your clerical administrative support, right? It's a family, it's a job group that has mostly, there's clerical type work, and the levels differ across the pay grades depending on the level of skill, effort, and responsibility that's being performed. That's not assumed, but it's being performed and assigned by the district for that individual in that job. The pay grades, the pay grades basically serve to group jobs together that have similar value in terms of that level of skill, effort, and responsibility. So they're grouped in the same pay grade. So let's say a custodian, let's say a cafeteria worker, The job is not the same, but the level of skill and effort and responsibility is comparable. So they're grouped in the same pay grade, right? The same with, let's say, attendance clerks. You may have attendance clerk at the elementary, you may have an attendance clerk at the middle school. And they may do attendance different times of the day, or more attendance one, less attendance the other one. But they're doing the same job. Then there's the pay range. And the pay range is a critical tool. The pay range is what helps us keep your structures connected, aligned to the market, and then setting your starting rates and setting a maximum value of pay. And there is a maximum value of pay for every job, whether we like it or not. There is. You know, I mean, I would like to be paid like an attorney, but I'm not an attorney. You know, there is a maximum value for the job that I do. And that is the case for every single job that we have. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the control points. I've talked about that. That's your minimums, midpoints, and maximums. And then policies and procedures. And these primarily serve to guide the administration of pay, to provide consistency, to have those as reference to work with the placement of individuals into the system, into the pay grades, and look at where others are paid and trying to maintain the internal equity with what you value, the experience that they may bring, the level of skill, effort, and responsibility of the job, the market value for that job, and where it's placed. And so those policies and procedures take your system and then they work towards giving you guidance in the administration of that system. All right, so I've talked a lot about compensation. We've referenced your market-based pay system that you have in place, but there are other types of pay systems. There is the single rate type of system. This is more commonly used for jobs sometimes where you're just going to pay a single rate regardless of the experience that someone has. So, for example, a crossing guard. You're going to pay $15 an hour or $20 an hour. You can't find them. They work only X amount of hours possibly, and so that's all you're going to set that rate of pay. A tutor is another job where typically it's this single rate of pay. Then we have the step scales. And step scales, they're that traditional salary step schedule where employees are paid in a very uniform manner based solely on one criteria, and that is experience. Okay? And the steps, that schedule is not aligned to market. It's a step schedule. And you create little slices through that schedule to have differentials. Sometimes the differentials may only be 10 cents because it's expensive to try to have a differential for every individual according to their years of experience in the organization. But it has no relevance, no connection to your market. It has no relevance to the starting rates of pay that need to be competitive, because to have a step schedule, you can't be market competitive. Because if you're going to pay based on years on a step schedule, you're going to drive pay for employees beyond the market rate, where we begin to overpay for jobs, where it begins to be more difficult for sustainability of a system that was implemented, but the administration of that system was different. So a very comparable step schedule, or one that everybody's very familiar with, is the teacher state minimum salary schedule. Who can afford to live on that teacher's salary. It has no bearing on the market, what you have to pay to recruit a teacher and to retain a teacher. It's a step schedule, and it has differentials on the years, right? That's what that's what a step schedule is. But it's not market-based. What you have is a teacher hiring schedule that has been adjusted based on market so that you remain competitive with your peers to recruit and retain teachers. Very different from the state minimum schedule. And then pay ranges, and this is what you have for all of the other pay groups. Pay ranges typically will, there's more flexibility. There's multiple factors that can be considered in the salary determination or decision when placing individuals into a pay range. And so you also have those control limits. So you have the control limit of the maximum. You have the control limit of the midpoint, which is really the target rate of pay or that market price that's within your peer group. And those policies that I mentioned, they're what define the values that you're going to use for placement of pay within a pay range system. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I had one with me and I left it somewhere. Okay, so that's the types of pay systems, and these are really the most common types of pay systems. The pay range is the most common system used, not only in school districts, but in private and public organizations. And it is not a TASB system. We did not, I'd like to take credit for it, but we did not create a pay range system. It's already there. It was existing, and it's one that we find that benefits and works best within school district environments. Okay, so I've mentioned step schedules. Those are the pay systems used in schools. Mentioned the step schedule is basically a single factor. That's primarily what it is. It's a single, typically used for a single job, and it spreads the pay, wide. Usually, the spread of pay for the job is again, solely based on years. There is no correlation necessarily with the pay and what you would make, in a sense, and the years to what the value of that job is. We typically find this type of a system used primarily for teachers. Again, the state minimum schedule is a great example of that. And employee pay advances very slowly. If you don't provide the type of pay increases that the board approves on a yearly basis for teachers that are not based on that experience differential, but that are based on a general pay increase to adjust your schedule year after year, the advancement in pay is very slow, because sometimes those experience differentials are $200 separation in pay. Pay range structures, just briefly, multiple factors are used. Correlation in pay is based on the job value and the market. And then the pay advancement, how employee pay moves through the range, is based on what the board approves as a general pay increase. So it's not an expected movement like it is sometimes in step schedules where I've got 5 years, now next year I go to 6 years and I'm going to get 20 cents more. A pay range is based on an annual review of the district's financial resources. That's that market-based pay strategy, and what the district can afford to give those increases. And it's not very commonly used for it's used for non-teaching jobs, right? We've talked about that, and employees advance through the range more quickly because we recommend the pay increases off of the midpoint. And so when employees get placed in the range and they're in the range at the bottom of the range because they may have less experience, if we give an increase off of the midpoint is going to be higher and it's going to advance the pay of those that are clustered at the bottom of the range closer and faster to that market rate of pay, which is the midpoint. Now, we began to slow down the advancement of employee pay beyond the midpoint. We don't give employees less of an increase. They still get the general pay increase percentage of the midpoint. But if employees are already paid above the range midpoint, their pay just begins to slow, the advancement begins to slow because they're getting the pay increase off of the midpoint that is a lower rate than where their pay is. And that is to slow their advancement, and so you don't overpay, but they're still receiving an increase, and they're still paid above the midpoint, and they continue to progress through the range. We talked about the state minimum schedule, an example of a step schedule there. The pay range control points being a very important tool in compensation because they set those control points. They set the starting rates of pay, which is the lowest pay for the job based on the job value and the market value for that job. That midpoint value is what the going rate for that job is within your peer group. Okay, that's your midpoint. We refer to that as the target rate of pay. We refer to that as the midpoint, target rate of pay, the competitive rate, and that is that target that we want to set your structures to when we're building them. And then there's always a maximum rate of pay, as I mentioned. The range width, and we're going to go into what each one of these control points does within a pay range. But the range width controls the variance of pay between employees. And we're going to see illustrations about that and talk a little bit more. As I mentioned, this is a very important tool, and we use it to set more competitive rates of pay. So we bring up the range, starting rate. Sometimes we increase the maximum to make sure that pay doesn't get maxed out too quickly. But we center that midpoint value to be connected as much to that market rate. I've mentioned market-based pay strategy. It keeps employees within a defined parameter of that competitive job price, that market rate of pay. And typically that parameter is within around 10%, it's around 20% of the market, with pay being competitive, being 10% variance from that market rate. The narrower and the tighter the pay range width, the more controlled and less variance in pay between individuals. The wider a pay range you have, then the more separation and wider pay difference between employees in the same range. And we've got some illustrations in a few slides down. I mentioned the control points. They're key in this market-based pay strategy. And those are your minimums, those are your midpoints, and those are your maximums. A market-based pay strategy, the intent is to compress pay, keep pay around that target rate of pay, that market value. To set pay ranges no wider than 20% above what that target rate of pay is, so that pay is competitive, as close to your target. As I mentioned, there are two opposing strategies and value systems when we talk about market-based pay versus step or job experience or schedule based on years of service. Briefly, I just want to touch base about some legal issues in pay. It's important to know Fair Labor Standards Act. That basically is federal regulation that covers overtime and the duties test associated with, what a exemption can be used to claim a job that would be exempt. And it also defines what the salary threshold is for a job meeting exemption, and it also sets the federal minimum wage, which is still $7.25 an hour for hourly employees. Other states actually have higher. Texas still has $7.25, and the federal wage rate is $7.25. There's a non-discrimination laws, and this is just to make sure that we've got, gender equity, that you're paying employees. As far as age, there's the Civil Rights Act, so, it prohibits discrimination with regards to race, color, religion, gender. There's the age discrimination. There's American with Disabilities. So it's all of those laws that HR would ensure that the district is compliant with. And then there's the Texas Education Code, and of course, that's covers contracts between educators and school districts, the minimum number of months of service, so all of those other good things, and then of course the minutes of instruction that has been the most recent change. I'm going to talk now about job value because I've been mentioning job value, and so there are measures that we look at when we're looking at job value. There are factors, value factors in pay. And so what we have here is we've got job-related factors, which is the market price, and then those job requirements, which I've mentioned, the level of skill, effort, responsibility. We've got, knowledge, abilities, those job duties, how difficult the job is, the accountability level of a job, the scope of impact. Is it just within the scope of impact as far as if there's an error, a decision that they make? Is it just within your work group? Is that scope of impact beyond your work group? Is it department-based? Is it entire district-based, right? So there's varying levels of these. And then there's the person-related factors. These are the degrees that that the job requires for that to be in those roles. Any type of specialized training, any type of work experience. As I mentioned, it could be outside school district, inside school district. What type of work experience? What specialized work experience? This could be your technology jobs. And then personal attributes, talents and abilities, and personal work ethic. Those are the value factors. Job-related is what is used when you're placing a position in the system. Person-related is when you're looking at how is this individual going to be paid for the job that they are moving into or that they hold relative to others in the system and in, let's say, in the same pay grade. Assessing job value, there's two. We've talked, there's the internal assessment, which is comparing jobs within the organization to each other based on compensable factors. And then there's the external assessment, and this, of course, is the market value, which is very critical in assessing the value here. The internal assessment, what goes into that is job documentation. It's basically the job description, right? What are the knowledge and the skill requirements of the job? What are the duties and responsibilities that are necessary for the incumbent to perform that job? The job evaluation and analysis, that is looking at those compensable factors that I mentioned, and it's basically what is the level of skill, what is the level of effort, what is the level of that responsibility, and the impact, the complexity, so that when you're placing the jobs, you're recognizing those, and you're going to place jobs with higher levels of skill, effort, and responsibility. You're going to place them higher in a grade versus those that have less responsibility. And compensable factors are lower. The job classification, that's basically a term for placement of jobs in a pay grade. Okay? So jobs are classified, they're assigned to a pay grade based on job value. Job value being skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions. So once those jobs have been reviewed, once we've assessed jobs, they're usually sorted. We sort them into job families so that we maintain them grouped based on similar nature of responsibility and skill requirements, although those may have varying levels of those. And it facilitates, by grouping jobs into families, facilitates the administration of pay, and it highlights the career path progression for these individuals. So, for example, having an instructional support pay family or pay group provides the career progression for your instructional aide, and then, you know, a special ed, maybe a self-contained higher level type position. And so it provides that career progression within that job family. It also distinguishes the exemption for jobs. So you want to have jobs that are exempt. You're going to have them on the administrative professional. And jobs that are non-exempt would be, you know, whether they're in the clerical and that administrative support, whether they're in that instructional support and that auxiliary group. And that just facilitates the administration ensuring compliance with those regulations and statutes that we just covered with the FLSA and the other items such as the Texas Education Code that we covered just recently. So common job families that we have in school districts, we've got, you know, administrators, professionals, clerical, instructional support, and then auxiliary and teachers. For larger school districts, we'll have technology. We'll have the police, public safety. Some even have a medical, health-related job family, like your district. Not all districts have a separate pay group like that. Not all districts have those jobs within their organization. So the job evaluation, again, is really looking at that internal assessment of your jobs based on the level of skill, effort, and responsibility. We refer to it as job value. I'm sorry, speak up. Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Cadena,
Sure.
do you want to take a break? I know you've been speaking for almost an hour. We can take
No.
a 5-minute break.
Oh, I mean, if you guys, I'm okay, but
You sure?
yeah.
We can take a little break here. Let's take a 5-minute break, guys.
We'll take a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Time is 6:25. All right, guys, let's get back to our seats. (6:31), back in session. Go ahead.
Thank you. So we're going to continue on with the job evaluation. Pretty much this process is what also creates what we refer to as this job worth hierarchy. And the job worth hierarchy is basically the pay grades. And so the jobs are placed into these pay grades. And again, based on the job value, with the pay grade hierarchy being established and jobs with higher level of responsibility and accountability and complexity, of course, get placed higher, and that creates that pay grade hierarchy, that job worth hierarchy, by looking at the job, the responsibility levels, the complexity of the job, and then using the market price, and we create that job worth hierarchy. Again, using those compensable factors that I've referenced, and we're going to go through them briefly here. It helps us to review jobs, compare the levels and that content of the job in a very consistent manner by using those compensable factors. The compensable factors, so these were specified in the Equal Pay Act of 1963. As I mentioned, we didn't create them. They were established. And they were established to create criteria for determining if jobs are substantially equal. Okay, so similar but not same in a sense. And these compensable factors that help us establish that job worth hierarchy provide measurable, objective, and based on job content, placement or classification of jobs within the pay system that are not based on a job title, they're not based on the incumbent, they're not based on the incumbent's qualifications or experience or credentials, because it's what is required of the job. And and it helps because jobs are not placed on personal circumstances of individuals, right? They're placed into the system, again, looking at these compensable factors, which are, and I've mentioned multiple times, skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. So skill, that is the level of education, the experience, the expertise that's required for that job. Effort is the level of decision making. Do you make decisions within your group? Do you make decisions within a division, a program? Do you make decisions for the entire district that have a huge impact? The communication. Do you communicate with employees, your colleagues? Primarily, do you communicate with the community and the board? And then responsibility, right? That's your organizational impact. The financial impact. Do you have budgetary responsibility? Do you just oversee a budget? Do you just monitor a budget? Versus truly creating that budget, ensuring that you are staying within that budget, and so having that budgetary responsibility. Do you evaluate individuals? Do you discipline employees? Do you have that responsibility? And then working conditions. These are primarily more so for your instructional assistants and your auxiliary, right? Exposure to biohazards, working conditions, you know, the hazards of working outside, working with electricity, plumbing, those kind of hazards that certain jobs carry with them just by the nature of the work that has to be done. So the job worth hierarchy, I've mentioned to you, is created when, again, we've looked at those compensable factors in jobs: skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And then we create that pay grade structure, whether it's three pay grades, 4 pay grades, 5 pay grades. That's going to depend on the size of the organization. It's going to depend on the number of jobs within that job family. There are some considerations to keep in mind when doing the job evaluation and when you're looking at jobs, is that it requires an objective assessment of those job responsibilities. So it's looking at the job responsibilities, not the incumbent. Right? What is a requirement of the job? It's looking at the experience that is relevant to the job for the placement of the individual, but the credentials do not determine the placement of the job, the credentials of the incumbent, right? So, for example, I know I worked at a school district where we actually had an attorney that wanted to be a front desk person. They had a family, and they wanted to give back. They wanted to do something, and they were happy being the receptionist. And so the job was the receptionist. Now, the district was benefiting from having somebody with that level of skill set, but the pay was not as an attorney. The pay was for a receptionist. So it's the job continues to be placed in the system based on the job and not the incumbent's credentials or, performance. As mentioned here, job evaluation is not based on incumbent performance or their own credentials or personal circumstances. So we get this question all the time, and I thought this would be a good one just to kind of include because, rightfully so, employees want to know, how was my pay grade determined, right? Jobs are assigned, as I mentioned, to pay grades based on the types of duties that are assigned for the job, that are required for that job, those compensable factors, skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions, and market price. That's the criteria that's used when placing jobs. And then we're going to talk shortly about movement of jobs and the impact that that makes after a system has been aligned, after we've gone through and reviewed jobs and determined placement, and then those jobs begin to get moved, and sometimes in isolation or in a vacuum without consideration and the impact that they have to other jobs when they get moved. And we'll look at that before we go there. The external assessment, again, this is the market. This is really comparing pay, your district pay, to other employers using the market data. So it's the process of evaluating your pay to what your peers are paying. We use the market median values when we do the comparisons. And the reason that we use that statistical measure is because it provides us the middlemost data set in a set of data points that's not influenced by the extreme highs or the extreme lows like an average would be. And it's a best practice in compensation and in conducting pay analysis. And so we use the market median values. We compare your pay to the median value of pay for those peer districts that we use. We also use the market data to help us set those ranges. Remember I mentioned we used the data to build your structures, and so we used the market value for the positions when we begin to establish that job worth hierarchy, that pay grade 1, pay grade 2, pay grade 3. There may be 3 jobs in pay grade 1 that are solid district jobs to match, and we refer to those as benchmarks, and I'll go into that. Because a benchmark is a job that is consistently the same across districts. Okay. Just spilled a little bit of water on your carpet. It also is used to adjust the range, so set your pay range competitive for jobs that are market sensitive. Some jobs, the market for those jobs moves a whole lot faster. So let's say for technology sometimes, the market for those jobs will move faster than it will for other jobs. And so having them in a separate schedule so that we can adjust those ranges and adjusting those ranges doesn't affect other jobs that don't get impacted by the fast market movement is beneficial, right? And so we use the market data to set the structures, to connect your structures, to see how competitive your pay is, and where your pay may be at risk, because it may be too low, and where you may be overpaying for jobs as well. There is a data limitation, and I've mentioned that already. There's not a market for every job. And so when we don't have market data for a job, it is that internal relationship, comparability, similarity of duties for that job relative to other jobs within the pay grade that has a market rate, and we're able to place the jobs that way. Just want to talk about competitive job markets. When you choose your peers, you're looking at who you compete with for talent, the type of organization, whether it's a public or private or not-for-profit, the size of the organization, and the size of the program, the size of the budget, the facilities, the enrollment, and then who's taking employees away from you. Who are you competing with? And looking at those become your peers, your competitors that you want to see how they're paying so that you're paying just as competitive as they are. Who you're losing your employees to. All right. Briefly, as far as market sources, we conduct a salary survey. That data is available to members of TASB HR Services. It's called our TASB HR data source. We also purchase third-party salary surveys that we use in conjunction with the school market data when we're doing pay study reviews. And then I know that there's other sources out there available that can be purchased. They're pretty pricey. They're some of those salary survey organizations are very specialized. Some are very specialized for technology jobs. Some are for, the health industry. But there's other salary surveys that you can purchase that are very reliable, highly high validity of data that they report. And then there's those that we discourage districts from even looking at. And many times we have employees that reach out and they go, well, my pay is low because when I ran this market report, which is a national market rate, it shows me that I am 20% below market. Well, one, you're not competing nationally, okay? And so, and two, those aren't necessarily your peers that you would be competing against. And so it's very important that the survey data that we use and who we compare to are those that truly reflect your competitive market and who you're really competing with. We're not going to set market for, let's say, salary levels in Washington State. Very different cost of living, right? So it's got to be relevant. It's got to be geographic in proximity and those that you compete with. Oh, thank you. Oh, and then self-reported. There's a lot of self-reported. You can go to the website and you can find salary data that people just submit. It's not validated. I could go in there and report I have this salary X. No one checks it, right? And so it's that's why we discourage. Those are not good resources for surveys. I mentioned benchmark jobs, common job roles among employers, similar skills and responsibilities, typically multiple incumbents. Custodian is an excellent benchmark job. Food service worker is an excellent benchmark job. Bus driver is an excellent benchmark job, right? Special ed director, teacher. We have a lot of strong benchmark positions that are common, similar across districts that we survey for, that we can match your jobs to and compare pay. All right, when we look to see how competitive your pay is, this is the calculation that we use. So we take your district rate, we divide it by what that market median rate is for that job, and that gives us a compa ratio. So if your district rate is less than what the market rate is, it's going to be less than 100% market match, right? Because you're paying lower than what the market rate is. So in this case, the district rate of pay for this illustration is $12.25 an hour. The market is $13.38. You divide the district rate of pay by the market rate, and you get a compa ratio of 92%. That means that district pay is 8% below for this job, this illustration. And that's the market comparison and the analysis, the calculations that we make when we're doing the analysis. We caution as far as when looking at market data. I know that we present, when we do the pay reviews and we present the market comparisons for jobs. And we caution when looking at the market data, because many times you're going to have individual pay comparisons be above market and below market. So there's going to be a variance. There's going to be a range of how pay compares to market for the jobs within the group that we're assessing or analyzing. It's important to not overreact when you look at data because many times there's a reason. There's a reason for sometimes pay to be below market or that target rate of pay, and that's because someone's new to a job. So if I have 0 years of experience, you're not going to pay me the target rate of pay for that job. You would be overpaying me. Well, I'd like for you to pay me that target rate with 0 years of experience, right? But you have to consider what is the level of experience that the individual brings to that job when determining the pay, when we're looking at that pay comparison. Then conversely, you can have someone who is paid 20% above market. Maybe they've been here for 40 years. that may be appropriate, right? But it's understanding why is the comparison that way, and it could be very appropriate that pay comparison is what it is. Now, if someone has 10 years in the job and they're being paid really low to market, then I would say that pay may be at risk because this individual has experience. There is not a magic number of experience to market rate. There is no magic at this year's you should be paid at this rate of pay. Salary surveys don't contain years of experience, but we know that pay should be closer to market rate the more experience someone has in the job. Sometimes we used to refer to it as a seasoned employee, right? They've been in the job. They know how to do the job. You want to pay them closer to market. But there's no requirement, there is no standard that market rate has to be at 15 years, that market rate has to be at 10 years. That there is, we use the years as a means to spread pay through the range to address compression. Okay, and that's different from pay altogether. And we're going to talk a little bit more about pay compression, because that's very important. In this illustration, just briefly, we have a teacher comparison. You can see here that the teacher pay overall is competitive at years 10, 15, and 20, but it lags market at years 0 and 5. So where would we want to make some adjustments in addition to, let's say, the general pay increase, so that it's consistently at the same market position across each one of those benchmark years, because each one of those benchmark years is important. You want to be competitive at entry. You want to be competitive at 5 years when you lose teachers, because it's known, research is out there that you lose teachers at 5 years the most, right? And so you want to have pay competitive 10 years because they're experienced, and at 15 and at 20. All right, we've talked about parts of the pay structure, so I won't stay on this too much just for the sake of time here, but you've got your pay grade hierarchy. With the higher the pay grade, the more complex and higher responsibility that the position has. And we're going to talk a little bit about the actual structure and ranges, but good pay structures keep pay in a competitive range. So going back to the system that you have in place, which is a market-based pay system. I need to speak to the mic here. It's a market-based pay system. Its intent is to compress pay around that target rate of pay, around that midpoint value. That's what a good pay structure does. It controls the spread of individuals between the range. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. A pay structure contains pay grades. It's a job family that highlights the career progression so that individuals can see where they can move from an assistant principal to an elementary principal to a middle school to a high school principal. It has the control points that we've talked about for your payroll costs. You've got to have control points. We don't have an infinite amount of financial resources. So we have to work with those. So we have to make sure that we're sustainable, that our systems are sustainable. And as I've mentioned, because of the recommended pay increases off of the midpoint, it advances those employees paid lower in the range closer to market much faster. What matters in the design is, again, using the market values for jobs to align your structures, establishing the right number of pay levels for that group. So you don't want to have too few, and you don't want to have too many, because then you don't differentiate the value sufficiently, the difference in the level of responsibility. If you have too many, and if you have too few, they may be very compressed, the difference in the levels of jobs. Spread pay through the range, and then how individuals are placed within the system, and those are your policies and procedures. Range width, briefly, this is the distance between the minimum and the maximum, and it controls the variance in pay between incumbents. So the narrower the range, the less difference in pay between incumbents in that range. The wider the range, the bigger the difference. The wider the range, the lower the starting rate of pay, the higher the maximum rate, right? You're not as competitive in your starting pay with wide ranges, because you have to have a very wide range for that. A narrow pay range gives you that strong starting rate, and then it controls the pay advancement. The midpoint progression, this is a very important concept. It basically is the difference between the midpoint of one pay grade and the next, and that is based on the market price for the jobs, and that defines the value, the job value difference between the jobs in that lower pay grade and the jobs in the higher pay grade. Midpoint offset, this is the distance either from the midpoint to the minimum or the midpoint to the maximum. And these are primarily used for setting how far away from market you're going to pay. So if your offsets are set at 14%, then that means that the top variance of pay that you have is going to be 14% above where that $10.50 target rate or midpoint rate is. Likewise, your starting rate is going to be no more than 14% below where that target rate is. So it controls the variance or the distance that your range, minimum and maximum, are going to have relative to your market rate. Market competitiveness here is primarily where your midpoint structure is set. And in this case here, you can see that your midpoint is at 1805. You have a computer tech market value of 1745. So your midpoint is set a little bit higher than your market rate. And so your structure is set. We talked about that match the market strategy. And so it's set just a little bit above in anticipation of market movement. I talked about the pay range width. Narrower ranges contain the pay difference between employees more and provide you more competitive starting rates of pay. They bring in the maximum, but we adjust. It's important to adjust your ranges regularly and monitor your system so that employees can continue to move through the range. Wide pay ranges allow for employee pay movement through the range longer, but you have lower starting rates of pay and higher range maximum values. And so it's when building these, designing these systems, it's how much does it cost the district to implement? Going from some, we worked with some districts where they had 80% wide pay ranges. And to bring in those ranges so that we can get them competitive starting rates of pay, we're not able to narrow that range in 1 year that much. We do it incrementally over time. And so it just depends on, the financial resources, the cost associated with making the improvements to that system. So I'm going to begin to talk a little bit about compression. And so when we talk about pay compression, we're talking about compression in pay between employees when we adjust the starting rates, that floor of pay or that lowest rate that you have for your pay groups, pay grades. So last year we moved to a $15 an hour starting rate. As we move the floor up, we need to make adjustments so that someone with 5 years can make a little bit more than someone with 0 years, because at 5 years, maybe they weren't even paid at $15 an hour. And so as we brought that $15 an hour, we decompress and we spread the pay. Now, doesn't mean that that by spreading the pay 15 years to midpoint, that's going to be necessarily like a standard. We have to spread pay, otherwise employees will be making the same rate of pay, those with more experience and those with less experience. And you'll have some morale issues, internal inequity, right? You're going to hear from the employees. And so we want to create some separation. What that separation should look like is driven by resources, financial resources. It's costly. It's costly to decompress pay. And so sometimes we decompress pay using spreading pay through the range across 15 years. Sometimes we spread it by doing 20 years through the range. But because we've adjusted the structure so much and they're much more competitive, if we began to spread pay beyond the midpoint, we begin to overpay because we have a market-based pay system. And that system is set higher. If we want to pay for years, then we need to have a different type of system. We have a step schedule. We have lower starting rates of pay, maybe smaller differentials between experience so that it can reflect everyone's year through that range. But it's two different systems. They're not the same. And the reason that we use this placement scale is because it helps correct that compression and to prevent that compression as we've adjusted those ranges up. But if we adjust beyond the midpoint, it becomes very costly, and sustainability is a big concern. We begin to overpay for jobs based solely on the individual's experience and not on the job, not on the value of the job. Because remember, the midpoint reflects the market price, the market value. We begin to pay above the midpoint. We begin to pay more above market price. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to move employee pay through the range and beyond the midpoint. That happens. Employees move through the range. They get an increase, and over time they move through the range, and they move beyond the midpoint. But it is through your general pay increases that they begin to advance through the range. That's what's used. It's not based solely on just their experience or their years that they're going to advance through that system or that scale. They're going to advance based on what you approve and what the district can sustain financially with those pay increases. Placement scales also provide transparency, and they simplify communication, right? You've got 5 years coming in. We've got, our employees at this are paid here, and so we'll bring you in here, knowing that the market rate That's your midpoint. And so someone from the outside coming in, you would make sure that you wouldn't pay them higher than what you're paying someone with similar years of experience, and not place them above the midpoint, because that is your market rate for someone that's experienced in the job. We have already talked about the limitations. Costly if you use less years to midpoint. Gets very costly if you only use 10 years. All experience isn't equal, right? If we got to use experience, and not all experience is equal. You could have, let's say, a supervisor that may have 15 years of experience, but let's say if we're looking at the total experience, it could be that of those years, maybe 5 of those years account for when they were just starting out in a level 1 assignment. Like say they're a food service worker, a food service supervisor. Maybe some of those years may reflect their years as a food service worker. And so again, the years are not all equal, and to go solely by years when we begin to spread pay away from the market is not the best practice. We want pay to be competitive, and that's why we promote that market rate. We also look at the structure and how it compares to market. So there's 2 analyses that we conduct when we're doing the pay reviews: how pay compares to market and how your midpoints compare to market values, and that gives us the market competitiveness of your structures. So in this case, your district may have a midpoint that's 1805. The market is 1745 for the jobs there, and so your structure is 3% above the market, right? And that's kind of what we ideally like to have as much as possible, competitive pay structures. All right, moving on, pay system policies and procedures. As I've mentioned, these really just define the organization's purpose for the pay system, right? How are you going to place individuals? Who has the authority, the roles in the administration of this system overall? It'll have a process, how individuals are placed in, promotions, reassignments that may result in demotions. And so it'll cover all of that and their guidelines or procedures. And they also address the legal requirements and help with ensuring that the district is, kept out of any legal considerations that may arise out of not following pay and those laws that we reviewed. These are the TASB compensation policies. DEA is a big one that we always refer to. The incentive and stipends, there's the leaves and absences, DEC, but the big one that we're always referring to is going to be your DEA and your DEAB. Okay, maintaining the pay system. So your procedures are going to talk about how do you apply the general pay increase? How do you classify jobs? How do you reclassify jobs? Reclassifying jobs means when you've got individuals that want their jobs moved up. They want to place them in a higher pay grade. And so looking at what do you look at when you have those requests? How do you determine whether a job needs to be reclassified or not? And in our process, if the job responsibilities have not increased substantially, significantly from where the job was placed in. Why? Because we've reviewed. We've done all that market review. We've aligned the jobs. We've placed them based on job worth hierarchy. They've been placed in the appropriate pay grades. Now they want the job reviewed. And so if the job has not changed, if there's not been a reorganization, then that doesn't justify a reclassification. And I know it's hard, but wanting to pay more for a job by placing it higher is not the best approach, because we create other issues, other inequities that we'll talk about. Your system also, your pay procedures guide you in promotions, reassignments, reinstatements, stipends. Who receives stipends? What kind of stipends? All right, so just for a little break, because I think I'm seeing glossy eyes, and I've been here for a while. So a quick question here. Who decides pay grade placement for jobs? Your HR. The superintendent has delegated his authority to HR to review the jobs, to determine the placement for jobs, right? Using compensable factors, taking a look at the level of skill, effort, and responsibility for those jobs. Who decides how much of a pay raise an employee will get? You. You have that responsibility. You make that determination based on the financial resources of the district. Who decides starting pay for a new employee? HR. Based on the guidelines, based on the system. It's not, they don't pull numbers out of the air. We want to be consistent. We want to be fair. And so we adhere to those processes, those guidelines. Common pay issues. I touched on pay compression. And compression defined is really when there's little or no difference in employee rates, though experience differs, skill set differs, and may warrant higher pay. And that's many times what happens when we raise the floor of pay, right? We compress pay. That's one issue with pay compression. And so the way that we fix this is spreading pay. We use the placement scale. It's a tool. It could be something differently. We could use, an algorithm. But this seems to simplify the process for employees to kind of see how the pay was decompressed at the bottom of the range where we raised the rates the most. So this is an example of a district where pay was very compressed. So you see everybody, they're all lined up at the bottom at the starting rate because they increased it to $15 an hour, but they didn't provide adjustments for those that had more experience. So everybody's pay is compressed, especially in pay grades 1, 2, 3, and 4. When pay was increased, they were all compressed. Then they applied placement scale. In this case, they used the 15 years to midpoint, like I said. It depends on resources. The adjustments were only up to the midpoint. Pay continues for the employees beyond the midpoint. And then this is the illustration after the placement scales were applied, where it moved the pay, it separated the pay between someone that had 5 years versus someone that had 2 years. And we see that separation now in those pay grades 1, 2, 3, and 4. We also have pay compression when we upgrade positions without conducting a full review or considering the impact to other jobs in that job worth hierarchy. So we've got a job that was established, classified, placed in pay grade 2. Now we want to move it to 3. What's the impact? What's the domino effect? We move it up to pay grade 3. If there was a job that was related, that maybe the level of skill and responsibility and working conditions was a little bit more, but now we've brought this one job up to the same pay grade, well, who do you think you're going to hear from? You're going to hear from the individuals in that one job where you've brought the one job up to the same pay grade, and they're going to say, wait a minute, we're doing a little bit more. It shouldn't be in the same pay grade. So then you got to move this one up. And then you move this one up, and oh, by the way, there's another job, right? It creates a domino effect. But I think what's most important is that you move the job up with no relevance to what the market value for that job is, without looking at what is the job value, what are those responsibilities? Are they comparable to the other jobs that the job is pay grade, that the job is in? And so, because there is a relationship that exists between jobs in same pay grades. So that's the other type of compression. Okay, employee pay increase overall. How do I get a pay increase? It's not a given. Employees, there's no entitlement that individuals, employees get an increase every year. It's based on what are the financial resources. Can you afford as a district, as an organization, to give employees a pay increase? We want to give our employees an increase. We want to reward them for their service, right? But you may not be able to at times. So there's no requirement, no legal requirement that says that you must provide an increase every year. But you value your employees and you want to reward them, and you look to see what can we provide, what's in our resources, so that we can give them an increase, to reward them, to show them that we value them. All right, there's different types of, two major types of pay increase calculations. One of them is based on the employee's base pay, and the other one is based on the midpoint. So we recommend using the midpoint of the range when providing pay increases, because it provides a uniform increase, the same increase amount for the jobs in the same pay grade that are comparable or similar in job responsibility. Unlike when you give a pay increase based on the individual's rate of pay or salary, what ends up happening is you begin to create a separation in the pay over time, where pay becomes polarized more and more. So, for example, Sally came in at $68,000 and Billy came in at $55,000. The board approves at 3%. If you give the increase off of base pay, of course Sally's going to get more. She's being paid more, right? She gets paid more. She's doing the same job as Billy. Billy's only going to get $1,650, and Sally's going to get $2,040. Over years, guess what? $2,000 added to $68,000 begins to impact. Where they started out, let's say, with a $13,000 pay separation, that becomes greater. Gets to $15,000, $18,000, $20,000. They're doing the same job. If you give them the same midpoint increase, they both get $1,827. Over time, the separation that was initially made, because there was a difference in years and level of skill that they brought in, or whatever they brought in with them, that is maintained over time. And so we don't create a bigger pay variance between those two individuals. There's more internal equity in this system. I mentioned that. The midpoint also moves pay of individuals that are in the bottom part of the range a little bit faster. And so at 9 years, if you give the pay increase off of the range midpoint, you're hitting the midpoint at that time frame. Versus, let's say, if you give the pay increase off of base pay for someone that's paid low in the range, okay? So it advances pay faster for those that are paid at the bottom of the range. There's other types of pay increases. The step increases I've talked about. They're not best practice. Merit-based increase that requires performance pay, and then lump sum payments. We saw a lot of this somewhat with ESSER funds, where we used $2,000, we're gonna give you one-time payment, $2,000. And so, we just don't recommend paying non-exempt individuals a stipend amount like that, but paying it maybe like in an hourly rate format so that you do the calculation for overtime, all that good stuff. But yeah, we want to give them the amounts as well. Okay, communication. How do I know what I will be paid in 5 years? Can't know. We don't know. We only know our budget, at most biennium, right? But we don't know what where we're gonna be 5 years down the road. And then individual salary determinations. I mean, these are primarily when someone's placed into the system and in their job. It's what is the quality of the employees that apply, right? Are they accepting those salaries that you're offering? Are you bringing in people? Are you looking at internal equity so that your morale is, that you don't have that morale issue? You don't want to place them too high in the range. You place them too high in the range, what happens? They get maxed out too quickly. And then they get, disincentivized because they're maxed. So you want to place them appropriately. And you want to make sure that you're not overpaying for jobs based on your internal individuals. We talked about type of experience. What do you value? Do you value education experience primarily? Do you value external experience as well? Private, public, those are things that, as administration, that's a pay philosophy that's also set. And then deciding salary offers. Your HR team determines the salaries for individuals based on the job. What do they bring to the table? What is the requirement of the job? Where are they placed? How are others internally placed? Do you look at total years of service? For teachers, you do, because they place a little bit differently in your system. You're going to give them credit for all of the credible years of service. You're going to also pay them based on their degrees and certifications, right? Different strategies for different jobs. As I mentioned, teachers, different from your admin professional, non-exempt. Placement scales provide just consistency. Then how does my experience count for pay? Well, it counts to an extent, but not every year for year is going to be valued necessarily. Some districts may only grant, 2 years of experience. They give you 1 year of credit for 2 years of experience. It just, it just depends on what is being valued, what has been the practice, trying to keep consistency. So experience counts, but not on a year-for-year basis necessarily, except for teachers. The credible years of service, you're going to give them credit for that placement. And other jobs that are related to your teacher schedule, right? Your librarians, your nurses, your counselors, you're going to follow the credible years of service document for placement of salary. There's some examples here. I'm just going to go through briefly because I know it's 2 hours into, I think, this presentation. So who would you pay more? This candidate. We got an elementary principal, has 10 years of teaching experience. The second candidate has 8 years of experience with 5 years as a teacher and 3 as an elementary assistant principal. What do you value more? You may want to value the assistant principal experience a little bit because they've been doing that job and they're being hired into that job. Network administrator has an associate's degree and 5 years of experience as a network administrator for a large bank, uses the same networking equipment as the district, maybe something different, but it's comparable. And then candidate 2 has a master's in education and 10 years of experience as a campus technology specialist. Well, campus technology specialist job is not the same as network administrator, right? And so you would want to value and credit the relevant job experience that the incumbent has for the position. Custodian. Would you grant the same experience for a custodian coming in with 7 years from a school district and 7 years from a hospital? I'd say yes. Doing the same job. Different environment, but they're doing the same job. Does my pay grade ever change? Only if there's been a significant and sustained change in job responsibilities. Or there's been a reorganization and the job responsibilities changed as a result of that. Then job reclassification, that's the process that's in our procedures. Not every reclassification necessitates a pay increase. So sometimes you reclassify the job and they get the increase off of the higher midpoint. There's not an automatic promotion increase for a reclassification. The job may just get aligned to a more comparable pay grade where other jobs are. And then this basically kind of walks through what that process would be. Increase in duties and responsibilities, that would be a reason for a reclass. Inappropriate action for that, I mean, you wouldn't provide a salary adjustment necessarily. You would place a job in that higher pay grade. You would follow your promotion and other promotion guidelines that you have. At times, pay has been decreased. People have been reassigned and demoted, and it should be. If the job is not as complex, then that salary, that pay has to be adjusted. But you have to ensure that you follow all the requirements, the 45 days prior to the start of the school year if it's a contract position. And then we talked about organizational changes, promotions. You want to look at the effective date. If they're moving between pay structures from a custodial to administrative support, you need to take a look. How are you going to deal with those type of movements? Is there a minimal promotional increase amount that someone should get? Always look at internal equity. We can't emphasize that enough. And then I talked about demotions, holding harmless pay. Sometimes you can reduce pay, and you should, as long as you follow all those requirements. And then making improvements. This is just adjusting your teacher schedule. Sometimes we have to provide additional adjustments so that you're competitive. As we did, as we saw in that one illustration, pay was low at the 0 and the 5-year mark, and we're adding additional adjustments to increase that lower part of the range. We adjust the range to make sure that it stays competitive. We don't advance or adjust the structure more than the general pay increase amount, because then we have compression. Because then employee pay, if we adjust the pay range the same as the general pay increase, employee pay doesn't move through the range. They'll languish down at the bottom of that structure. They won't move through the range. Their pay will be compressed at the bottom. Adjusting structures is important. It just allows for movement of pay through the range once those structures are adjusted. And this is just an illustration over time of someone's pay moving through the range. As a result of pay increases, that's how pay moves through the range. Employee pay moves through that range as a result of pay increases. And over time, they'll be at the top of the range. We don't know how long. We don't know. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the type of pay increases, how strong those pay increases are. We've talked about adjusting the pay ranges. Oh, I'm at the end. Questions?
At this time, I'll open it up for questions.
I know it's a lot of information.
Yeah.
This training is many times a day, a full day of training. So you are going to get credit for sitting there and listening to me. That's why we had you sign that sign-in form. But it's a lot of information in a very condensed time. But I hope that it was helpful.
We absorbed most of it.
Good.
I hope.
I do.
Go ahead, Mr. Nakara.
Cadena, so when we have positions, when we engage with TASB, right, for a salary study, and we have positions where there isn't a comparison in a school district, right, then what do we use as a comparison?
So so let's say there's not a market for this particular job that we don't survey, right?
Well, we can
Because
pick one. We have an employee clinic,
Okay.
and there aren't very many school districts with employee clinics.
that have clinics. So I mentioned that we purchase third-party salary surveys. They're non-school surveys. Basically, it's survey data for jobs that are found, that are common and found outside of education. And so we use those. We use those and combine them with school market for jobs that are in education so that we can gauge what other employers are paying outside of education for the job. But then we also use those for positions where there is not a market in our school group, because we just don't survey that job. I use my hands a lot. So that's what we would do. We would pull non-school market.
Ms. Cadena, so two of our speakers earlier talked about the years of experience. And can you help me understand that? Because somehow the translation is that when we tried to fix the compression, which was a long time coming, it was a problem that we introduced, and I'll say we, even though I know it started way before I joined the board, but it's a problem that we created. It's not something that just happens by itself. It's based on the decisions that we make, and because we don't have a disciplined and structured approach to the way we pay, we as an organization create that problem, right? And so the understanding is that we just capped out at 15 years experience. So when we tried to fix compression, if you had 50 years experience, we said, oh no, well, you're going to get credit for 15 and that's where your pay is going to be. That's it. Sorry, too bad. But yet, as I've looked at individual instances and I look at the distribution, I see what you described, where it is structured around the midpoint. But more importantly, those with more years of experience are paid higher, which is exactly what you want to see. So I mean, can you help me understand that? Because, I mean, when I hear one side, I absolutely agree. Well, that's not fair. But then when I ask a very specific question, I see the information and I think, well, that makes sense. But it can't be both ways. So
Right.
where is it being lost?
So, I mean, you made a very good point. It can't be both ways, okay? I mean, we either have a market-based pay system where pay is going
And
to
I
be...
said something that I don't even understand what I said, but I hope you'll help me.
I
Okay.
will do my best. Where pay is going to be clustered around that rate. Or we have a system where we have a bunch of steps, right? 40 years, 30 years. But the rates of pay for that system will need to be less. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. It's costly. You'll end up, we all know that district financial resources are taxpayer money, and we want to make sure that we're utilizing those monies in the most effective and efficient way. And so if we began to pay based solely on, let's say someone that has 30 years of experience or 40 years of experience, then the scale or the compensation system that would be in place has to be a different one that's driven solely by creating a separation between employees and their years by some amount to create a separation. So that someone with 5 years, someone with 10 years, someone with 15 years, someone with 20 years, someone with 30 years is paid. But to have a separation that's going to be more than 10 cents, more than 15 cents, is too costly because you're basically just trying to create a little separation just to value that additional year. And the other thing that that comes to mind as I'm talking about this is that at some point in time, additional year of service, another year of experience, doesn't bring that same value. At some point in time, experience doesn't carry the same value that we bring. And it's a given. It happens in every job, right? I come in with 15 years. They're great. I'm highly experienced. And I gained 20 years of experience, and they're still important. That experience is still important. But the value of that experience has begun, the value of that experience has really begun to diminish a little bit. Because over time, the return, I think of it as return on investment kind of concept, right? The return of the experience, someone coming in, having that relevant experience in the job when you're placing them in, and they really bring in those changes. They really have that knowledge. They're able to make those changes, but that value is not the same a few years down the road. So to value one more additional year the same is really kind of using the monies just to create a differential solely on one more year of experience. And I may not have explained as well as far as to your question, but it's two different opposing systems. One is market, it compresses pay against this rate, The other one is job experience, and that separates, it moves pay away. But there is not an association with market. If you try to have market and this experience that's placed beyond market, it's, I continue to say costly, but we begin to overpay for the job because we've set those structure and we set pay based on those market rates.
So,
Few districts pay beyond spread pay or pay beyond the midpoint, where we've established a market-based pay system. Those that pay beyond, let's say, what would be a midpoint, which is really, those systems really don't have a midpoint. They're just step schedules, right? Those few that do pay have very low rates of pay because they can't have that market competitive pay and pay for each year, separation for each year.
so in the recommendations that TASB gave us in order to address our compression, did TASB recommend that we stop giving or that we not adjust salaries for anyone who had more than 15 years experience?
So with the placement scale and the way those work is that employees receive the general pay increase regardless of whether they've got 13 years or they got 18 years or they got 20 years, right? They get that general pay increase. We recommended that you don't create differentials in pay between employees beyond 15 years. Because if someone's already paid at midpoint, if someone's or above, and they've got more than 15 years of experience, they're already being paid for that experience, and they're already being paid above the market value for their job. So it's not that they don't receive pay. They still receive an increase. We just don't create separation because the pay's not compressed once we've begun to move it, once it's begun to move above the midpoint. It's not compressed with the other pay for those below 15 years when we brought up that starting rate of pay.
And the example that you provided helps me understand that because, yeah, the illustration, I think it was between, I'm going to get the names wrong, Billy and Sally. Mm-hmm. Those, where, yeah, absolutely, you do want to.
So there's some separation, right?
There is some separation.
And you want to give them an increase so that their pay continues to advance. You give them the midpoint pay increase so that the pay separation remains the same over time because initially they were placed appropriately based on one having more experience than the other one in a sense, right? And so if the, let's say if we were to have raised the rate of pay for that job and it was the same as what Sally was making, well, Billy has less years. And so that pay would have been compressed, right? And so now Sally would say, well, wait a minute, I have more years and we're paid the same. Where employees are paid above the market, there is separation already. There's separation for them. And so the separation doesn't need to be made like it needs to be made below the midpoint.
David, do you have something?
No.
No? You're fine? You answered.
Yes.
You asked it. Okay. Anybody else?
Yes. Ms. Guys, so if I understand, and I guess the question also for HR. So all our employees, and I guess me to HR, all the employees that were 15 and 30 years, those employees were below the, or above the midpoint, or right now at midpoint?
So, and I'll let Selena answer as well, but no one should be paid less than the midpoint if they have 15 years, right? If they have more than 15 years and they were paid below the midpoint, they got an adjustment to make sure that they're not paid below the midpoint. So it moved them, but no one should be paid below the midpoint. And if someone was paid close to the midpoint and they got the increase of, was it 6% last year? It moved them beyond the midpoint. And so there was not a need for an adjustment. The formula didn't get, because they moved through and beyond the midpoint.
So all our employees that were above the 15 years to 30 years have been with us are above the midpoint,
At midpoint or above?
above midpoint. Does TASB have a maximum pay grade?
Years or?
Years
'cause
or, I know
for
we
a
have-
placement
Yes, ma'am.
scale? Okay. No, I mean, we sometimes will run one that spreads pay across 20 years, because remember, the last number of years in increments between the minimum and midpoint, the wider those differences are. So let's say for a 10-year separation, those years, the difference between those years, using a 10 years to midpoint, we may have a 30-cent difference between each year. So that's going to be an added 30-cent adjustment that has to kick in if someone is not paid at that year, depending on the grade and depending on their years. In a 15 years to midpoint, that separation may, the difference in those years may be, let's say, 20 cents instead of the 30 cents. So it becomes a little bit more manageable, right? And then in the 20-year one, it may be 15 cents between those years. So it's not like it's this standard of separation in pay. It is a means of creating a separation. Sometimes it's small because trying to stay within resources, but still valuing experience a little bit more for those where we've really raised that lowest entry rate of pay. And we had someone with 10 years, and they're now making what someone with 0 years coming in. That's where that spread in pay needs to occur, because that's where the fullest compression in pay occurs. Does that help?
I think we're done. Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Cadena.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Likewise, have a good evening. At this time, I will adjourn the meeting. Today's May 1st, 2023, and the time is 7:49.